Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is a groundbreaking series that dives into the lives of people living in the last frontier. Each episode introduces you to colorful characters from around the state. Funding for Indie Alaska is provided in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company. Catch the latest episodes at alaskapublic.org.
The National Weather Service.
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is Alaska Weather. I'm meteorologist Mike Ottenweller, and tonight is November 27th, Black Friday. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. As always, you can stay up to date with all of our weather information on our regional page, ARH, Alaska Region Headquarters.noaa.gov, and follow us on our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. That's 24/7. On Facebook, you can find us using NWS Alaska, and on Twitter, you can use the call sign at NWS Alaska with the hashtag AKwx for a regional perspective on what's going on across Alaska weather. And then for this show and a few other segments later on this evening, you can use YouTube and use the hashtag AKwxTV, Alaska Weather TV. So let's jump right into the forecast tonight. We're looking at our hazardous warnings and watch and advisory page here. As you can see, most of the activity is up towards the higher elevations of the Alaska Range and then up towards the interior portions. These are high wind advisories for the upper Koyukuk Valley, eastern Alaska Range, and near Denali, and then a high wind warning for the, that's the upper Koyukuk Valley. And so with those, we do expect high winds for much of the evening into later tonight. Those should all expire at around midnight. But stay tuned to your local forecast in case those decide to extend those out a little bit further in time. But for now, midnight for all those wind advisories and warnings. So our headlines for this evening: warm and wet is going to continue across much of the state. Above seasonal temperatures and wet conditions, mainly for the coastal areas and down towards southeast Alaska. We also have pretty dangerous avalanche conditions out there. Avalanche warning has been issued for Hatcher Pass. That's in effect until 8 o'clock tonight. This has been in effect for most of the week with all of this recent warm-up and still snow at higher elevations. The snow has been coming very wet and heavy, and then when you follow that with rain and wind, those conditions become very dangerous. So avalanche warning at Hatcher Pass, and you can look at our webpage for more information on that. And then for southeast Alaska, we do expect heavy rain to develop tonight due to a frontal system moving into that area, and that will spread all the way through southeast Alaska on into the weekend, and then diminishing rains. Heavy right now at Prince William Sound, but those should diminish into the overnight hours. So let's take a look at our satellite loop here, and you can see our primary area of low pressure is spinning here just to the east of Dutch Harbor near the Alaska Peninsula. Another area of low pressure will eventually start to work its way into the western Aleutians. Let's put that into motion one more time. There's our secondary area of low pressure. This is going to bring up some more warm air into the western Aleutians, but this is our primary focus here. This is our driver of weather across the state, as we say, and we'll see it here a little bit better on our closer to home mainland satellite view. Here's the area of low pressure. It's starting to expand a little bit as it weakens, starting to become a little bit more diffuse across the northwestern portion of the Gulf. But as we see that do that, it is bringing a bunch of moisture from the North Pacific into the Gulf of Alaska, starting to work its way towards southeast Alaska. I'm going to loop this one more time and draw your attention to this area of actually clearer skies and higher pressure. And with that, that is what's really bringing a lot of that southerly flow into much of Alaska, keeping rain for coastal areas, snow for interior locations, and that's due to a ridge of high pressure that's over northwest Canada. We call it the Pacific High, and that's over northwest Canada, northwestern United States at this time, and that is really stalling the entire pattern, and that's what's going to bring the moisture and the rain into southeast Alaska going into the weekend. So looking at this afternoon's weather map, we have our area of low pressure that is really causing all of the dynamic weather across the state, and we see it down at 977 millibars. An occluded boundary is stretched out across the Gulf, and that is starting to push that moisture once again back up into coastal regions. We did see some moderate to heavy rain on the Middleton radar this afternoon, and again, rain is expected to continue to work its way off into southeast Alaska, or it is into southeast Alaska. Will continue to drift towards the Dixon entrance as we go into the overnight hours. A little bit farther inland, we did see the rain turn over to snow once we finally got the cold enough temperatures, mainly north of the Alaska Range. Even Talkeetna was rain this afternoon. So north of the Alaska Range, some rain and snow mixing in up there. Along the Arctic coast, we did have some fog reported, fairly widespread fog along those areas with that warm air meeting the ice pack up there along the Chukchi Sea. And then as we look towards the southwest Alaska, we did see some rain mixing in over southwest, and then some snow once we got back towards Nunivak Island. And then more snow on the backside of this system where we expect the cold air to be wrapping around down behind this. Here is just the fringes of our next system that we were talking about there on the satellite loop, and now you can see that starting to work its way into our area in the tonight forecast period, down to 971 millibars, and it starts out as snow for the western Aleutians, but then quickly changes over to a mix, and then eventually all rain as we get into the warmer sector of that system. Looking a little bit closer towards home now, Kodiak Island low pressure system up to 984 millibars, starting to weaken. And with that, we do expect that to push more rain and just be more of a forcing mechanism for pushing rain onshore. Moderate rain expected for much of southeast Alaska into tonight. The rain should start to diminish over south central Alaska as we lose some of that forcing and the low does begin to weaken. We will see things mix in with snow again as we start to get towards the Alaska Range, but it should be very wet snow, not expecting much in the way of accumulations, but that could be a factor once again for avalanche conditions. As we get north of the Alaska Range towards the interior, we do have some light snow up there, some fog remaining along the Arctic coast, and then another weakening area of low pressure at 979 millibars, spinning around and helping to reinforce some of that cold air down over the western portion of the Bering, but that's really going to be confined to the western portion of our area as we see mostly mixed precipitation over the southern half of the mainland. As we look out into Saturday, we see our area of low pressure that is in the western Aleutians continue to work its way eastward down to 976 millibars, and again, a little bit of a mixed precipitation on the front edge, but becoming all rain on the back edge with that warmer air. Snow should eventually wrap behind that system, but it's going to be a long time getting there as it's a fairly widespread system. As we look towards Kodiak, the area of low pressure remains fairly stationary. This occluded boundary has not moved too much, so that's going to keep the modest rain over southeast Alaska. Things should slowly improve, especially the winds that we've seen blowing through some of the gaps today. Even Palmer had some winds. Those winds should start to subside by Saturday as this system does weaken and it starts to shift this ridge of high pressure just ever so slightly to the east. Showers of mix of rain and snow over much of southwest Alaska. Those should be fairly intermittent as this area starts to break up a little bit. And then again, some more warm air making it into the Chukchi Sea and the Bering Strait as we see some rain even getting all the way up there. And we do have a little bit of snow left over the northern portion of the Bering. This is an Arctic boundary here that's going to remain mostly stationary and confined to this area where this cold air is bottled up over the northern portion of Canada, meeting this warm air that's been brought in on this jet. And so with that, we will see continued snow flurries and snow showers through much of that area. On to Sunday, that stationary boundary just a little bit further south now, that Arctic front, and we do expect more snow to continue on that. A new area of low pressure forms in the southern portion of the Gulf at 996 millibars, and that will help most of the precipitation to come to an end as this becomes the new system that moves out of our area. So we should see improving conditions for most places as the heavier rain changes over to a light rain-snow mix. For much of south central, again, improving conditions there as well. Just some rain along the coast with some rain and snow inland on Sunday. Should not be an overly wet weekend by any means for south central. And then our area of low pressure is working its way towards the east down to 975 millibars, and that will bring another round of warmer air and more precipitation to areas from the eastern Aleutians through the Alaska Peninsula. Weakening area of low pressure remains over the western Bering at 986 millibars, and that will continue to keep some light snow and snow showers over the Bering. Looking at today's temperatures as of 4 o'clock, much of southeast Alaska was in the 40s, the low to mid 40s, 42 degrees there at Juneau, 46 degrees at Yakutat. And as we got towards south central Alaska, we had 42 degrees at Cordova and 34 degrees, at, a little bit colder there in Valdez, 39 here at Anchorage, 35 degrees at Gulkana, and 36 and rain at Talkeetna as of 4 o'clock. A little bit farther to the north, we did have some cool down, but again, it's been anomalously warm across the state, much above average for this time of year, and we see mid to upper 20s across the central portion of the state, and it's not until you get north of the Brooks Range that you have any of those single digits up there and starting to fall to these below zero temperatures as you get up along the Arctic coast. We did have Nome come in at 26 degrees, and Point Lay was 9 degrees. As we look towards southwest Alaska now, many of the areas here were in the upper 20s over the northwestern portion of southwest Alaska, and then becoming about 32 degrees at Bethel and 40 degrees as you got a little bit closer to the Alaska Range. Mid to upper 30s across the Bristol Bay area, and then going out over the Aleutian chain, we saw things slowly trend from the lower 40s into the upper 30s. Taking a look at tonight's low temperatures, again expecting fairly warm conditions across much of southern Alaska, with mid to upper 30s and low 40s across southeast Alaska. We'll expect temperatures mainly right around 30 to 32 degrees for much of southern Alaska. And then we'll see the cooler temperatures in the teens and the single digits as you get towards the Alaska Range and the Brooks Range over the northern portion of the state. About 20 to 25 degrees over the Seward Peninsula, and southwest Alaska will experience upper 20s to low 30s tonight. On into Saturday now, again expecting fairly mild conditions, mid to lower 40s for southeast Alaska, upper to mid upper 30s for much of southern Alaska, with 40 degrees to 45 degrees along the coastal areas. As you get up towards the interior, expect conditions to cool off there once again, about 20 degrees as we get a little bit farther north for much of the interior. Will be the high temperature on Saturday, and then we expect single digits along the Arctic coast with mid 30s along southwest Alaska. Taking a look at the flying weather now, with that strong southerly push, we do have plenty of IFR conditions, especially in the mountain gaps of southeast Alaska, so be advised flying through those areas. Pockets of IFR will still remain over southern Alaska as that strong onshore flow continues for much of those higher elevations, and then pockets of IFR with the fog along the Arctic coast, and again with very weak flow and plenty of moisture in place, IFR conditions will be along the west coast as well. Taking a look at the passes for tomorrow, Anaktuvik will be IFR, should improve to MVFR. Same story for Adigan. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be MVFR through the majority of the pass, but we expect the east entrances to be in the IFR category. And then on into Rainy Pass now, expect the east entrance to be IFR as well with the moisture there. MVFR conditions though predominantly through the pass. And windy should be IFR in the central portion, MVFR in the central portion, IFR on the southern end, and VFR on the northern end for pilots looking to make their way through there. Isabel, MVFR improving to VFR. Mentasta will be visual flight rules. Tanita will be instrument flight rules becoming marginal, and Portage will be instrument flight rules throughout the day, as well as Chilkoot and White Pass with that moisture in southeast Alaska. Taking a look at the freezing levels now, again, as you would expect, plenty of warm air, 2,000-foot freezing levels hugging much of the coastline here, so the precipitation for much of southeast Alaska will be mostly rain unless you climb up to the higher elevations, and freezing levels climbing all the way to 10,000 feet here in the southeastern portion of the Gulf. Surface line extends all the way up to the Seward Peninsula, and then our next pocket of warm air coming up courtesy of that area of low pressure. So looking at icing now, expecting those icing levels to be fairly high, above about 9,000 feet here near the Dixon entrance, about 6,000 feet over the armpit of the Gulf, and then above 4,000 feet here for southwest and western Alaska, and that'll extend all the way up into the northern portion of the Bering, that light to isolated moderate area. Above 6,000 feet, which is pretty high for this time of year for the northern portion of the state, and above 6,000 feet out over the western Aleutians. Taking a look at our jet stream now, we can see fairly active jet, but most of it is going to remain south of the state, coming in in the area at about 135, increasing to 155 knots, diving quickly south in support of this area of low pressure here, and then it jumps back to the north, and that's where we really see that North Pacific moisture being pulled up and into southeast Alaska at 140 knots, so good upper level support of that moderate rain that we expect later tonight. And then it moves off into northern Canada where it couples up with a polar jet, and they're together at about 100 knots over northeastern Canada. And then an area of low pressure over the lower portion of the lower 48 at about 80 knots. So looking at our steering level winds now at 9,000 feet, we do have these main areas of low pressure that are going to drive the winds. So we expect southerly winds becoming quickly to the west and then south, wrapping around this low in counterclockwise fashion. 65 knots is our strongest area here along the along eastern Russia. and then about 45 to 20 knots around this area of low pressure over the western Aleutians. As we look towards southeast Alaska, we can see that area of high pressure that we talked about in the satellite image. So winds kind of going in a clockwise fashion around that at about 40 knots at 9,000 feet, unless you're over top of that ridge, and then you can expect about 60 knots. Taking a look at the 3,000 foot winds now, again, mainly flowing around those areas of low pressure, very similar to the 9,000 foot winds, and just a little bit lighter in nature, coming across the Gulf at a southerly direction at about 25 knots, into the mainland there at about 30 knots out of the due south. Over the northern portion of the state, coming out of the northeast, working to the southwest at about 60 knots. And over southeast Alaska, expect southerly flow becoming more westerly at about 40 knots and then slowly subsiding to about 30 knots once we get inland. So looking at our turbulence now, most of our pockets will be associated with terrain below 8,000 feet where we saw that strong jet from the south. Over the northern portion of the state and into the northern Bering Strait, we expect a small area of occasional widespread moderate below 6,000 feet. An area of isolated moderate below light to isolated moderate below 10,000 feet over the central Aleutians, and then for southeast Alaska below 8,000 feet over the eastern Gulf. Please stay tuned. We'll be right back with your marine forecast.
Good evening. I'm Harry Keeling, and on behalf of Alaska Public Media and the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation, welcome to Hangar Flat. Tonight we have back, again, very fortunate to have back Dr. Melchor Antuñano. Dr. Antuñano is the director of the Civil Aerospace Medical Institute, and we were fortunate enough to have him for our fall safety seminar on November 21st. And we've also taped a couple of hangar flying sessions, one last time if you caught it, talking about safety and survivability. But tonight we're going to talk about human factors and safety issues of cockpit automation. I think you'll enjoy Dr. Mel's talk about something that's near and dear to all of us. Dr. Mel, welcome back.
Thank you very much. So that's another area of significant interest, cockpit automation, because when it truly started developing and fast was in the mid-1980s. And one of the triggers was, of course, the oil crisis, the prices of fuel going up. So we needed to increase the efficiency of airplanes. But in order to increase the efficiency of airplanes, it was thought that it was better to include more and more computer internet interfaces to improve the efficiency of the engines, how you were doing navigation in flight. So that was one of the initial triggers to make operations safer but also more economical. Well, since then, we have had many developments in the area of cockpit automation. We have now what is called glass cockpits, and the reason to call it glass cockpits is because what predominates in the cockpit is big glass screen. So that's why it's the term glass cockpits. But we started with analog technologies, where you would use pneumatic systems, you would use hydraulic systems controlled through a certain level of automation. Now we have digital systems. But we can assume that, well, everything was right with the introduction of new automation. But we're having issues also related to automation because there are different philosophies in the design of cockpits. There is one where you can say, well, why don't you use computers to actually prevent pilots from exceeding certain envelope aspects of the flight, so that then the airplane is going to be protected against some deviating or exceeding capabilities of the airplane. Another philosophy, it says essentially, well, why don't you give the pilot authority instead of to a computer depending upon the circumstances? Well, different manufacturers have taken one of those two philosophies, one where the ultimate decision maker is the computer, and in other ones where the decision maker is the human. So while we have humans in the cockpit, we have to make sure that from a human factors perspective, you have that human-machine interface appropriate. We have had many examples of accidents where the cause of the accident was really attributed to some issues with the automation, either failure of the automation or lack of understanding of what the automation was doing in that part of the flight. There have been some studies done, like for example MIT did one years ago, that had to do with vertical navigation and horizontal navigation, where they were identifying what kind of questions the pilots were asking themselves during the flight about what the computers were doing. So if you have a pilot, for example, asking the question, why is the computer doing that? Well, that's worrisome. But then you have the next question, which is, well, what is it going to do next? That's even worse because that means you are not situationally aware of what the computer is doing with your aircraft. So we have to give that authority to the pilot, keep the pilot in the loop, but use the automation as a tool to augment the capabilities and actually to help the pilot fly the aircraft, because ultimately the pilot is responsible for the safety of that flight.
Do you see, our audience is not exclusively general aviation, but predominantly general aviation around the state. Can you think of applications for some of these studies, some of this research, specifically to GA operation?
In fact, there are several pilot schools in the United States where now, instead of learning to fly like in an old Cessna 150, 152, 172, now you start with technologically advanced aircraft that have glass cockpits. And the initial training for those pilots is now with glass cockpits, is not with all analog cockpits. Which begs the question, well, what is the impact of learning to fly, let's say with a digital cockpit, with digital instrumentation, when you may have to go and fly an analog aircraft? Is there going to be a transition issue? And yes, some of the findings is that depending upon how you learn, you may have issues switching to the other one, issues about who has the authority. Is it the pilot or is it the computer that is controlling the aircraft or some functions of the aircraft? So then you have the issues also of, let's say that you do every takeoff and landing automatic because of the capabilities that you have on the airplane. What's going to happen to the level of the proficiency of the pilot when they have to deal with an emergency and now they have to actually take over control of the aircraft? Are they up to speed to say, I have it, and take it away from the computer? So are many of those questions that we are dealing with, which that doesn't mean that has decreased the level of safety. We continue to improve safety, but we have to take into account that human-machine interface that is very critical, because now we're expanding to another area, suborbital spaceflight. There's at least one design that would be remotely operated or automated flight.
Let's do this, because unfortunately I've run out of time yet again. I'm going to ask you back one more time and we'll kind of wrap it up. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I'll promise you at least one more with Dr. Mel, and until next time, fly safe.
And welcome back to your marine forecast. Let's take a look at our ice pack now. We can see our sea ice is continuing to grow a little bit over the northern portion of the Arctic there. And really the key thing from the ice forecasters today that they mentioned is that this new shoal called Herald Shoal is starting to grow, and that is representative that the entire Chukchi Sea is pretty much ready to go. It's ripe right now for becoming ice fast across the entire area. Meanwhile, along the western coast, ice continues to grow, but at the same time it's also being broken up by that warm and strong westerly wind, south to westerly wind, and that's especially noticeable where the ice pack is being broken up just a little bit there south of Nunivak Island. A little bit of ice in Cook Inlet, but bad imagery today, or lack of imagery today I should say, has led to not much conclusive evidence on changing that forecast. So now into southeast Alaska, we can see southerly winds over the inner passageways to southeast, 25 to 40 knots, especially strong near Dixon Entrance here, expecting gusts up near the 50-knot range, and seas will be on the order of 5 to 8 feet. Gusts about 55 knots out of the south for the open waters of the Gulf of Alaska, becoming southeast and then south 25 to 35 knots, and seas generally on the order of 15 to 18 feet. Looking into southeast on Sunday now, southeast to southerly winds over the inner passageways. Again, those higher gusts will be mainly confined to the southern portions of the forecast area, 15 to 35 knots with seas anywhere between 3 and 7 feet. Out over the open waters, 10 to 35 knots with higher gusts once again down here, and expecting seas between 11 and about 20 feet. Over south central Alaska on Saturday, expect southeast winds over much of the open waters in the Prince William Sound, becoming northeast and then once again southeast west of Kodiak Island and Shelikof Strait, anywhere between 15 and 25 knots, and seas will be on the order of 4 feet in the protected areas, becoming about 15 to 13 feet over the open waters. And then on Sunday, expect south to southeast and then easterly flow for much of the area except for the northern portion of Cook Inlet out of the northeast with a little bit of a lee trough, anywhere between 10 and 20 knots, and seas will be about 10 feet over the open waters, down to about 3 to 4 feet over the protected areas. For the Alaska Peninsula, expect westerly flow north of the peninsula and northwest flow on the southern end, 15 to 25 knots on the north side and 25 to 35 south, with the highest seas being south of King Cove at about 17 feet, lighter seas for Bristol Bay at about 4 feet. And then on Sunday, expect things to become more southeast to easterly with about 25 to 30 knots of wind, and seas will be anywhere between 6 and 12 feet. Looking at for the Aleutians on Saturday, expect westerly flow for the eastern Aleutians, but southeast to easterly flow for the western Aleutians, anywhere between 30 and 35 knots, and seas generally between 10 and 17 feet. And then on Sunday, becoming more northwest as that area of low pressure slides by, a little bit more southwesterly towards Dutch Harbor, 20 to 30 knots, and again, seas between 10 and 22 feet. For the west coast, expecting a little bit more variable conditions out there, northeast winds near Gamble, but then becoming west and southwest towards the western portion of the state. Some freezing spray also, especially along the ice pack there near Nunivak Island and out towards the west there. And expect seas on the order of about 6 to 12 feet. And then on Sunday, expect southeast easterly flow out of the, at about 20 to 25 knots. Some freezing spray here still near St. Matthew Island, and seas between 6 and 8 feet. And then working our way towards the Arctic coast, mainly east to northeast flow all the way up to 45 knots here off of Cape Lisburne, and seas climbing as high as 13 feet with some freezing spray. Similar conditions, just a little bit lower speeds on Sunday with freezing spray still near the Seward Peninsula and Cape Lisburne. Taking a look at tonight's forecast, once again, recapping, expect this moderate area of rain to move into southeast Alaska tonight. Not anticipating any flooding, but there will be some heavy rainfall throughout southeast Alaska for much of the weekend. Mainly low pressure spinning areas of moisture around, and the colder air still bottled up north of the Alaska Range, keeping snow confined to those areas. We'll see a similar story on Saturday as that low pressure slides slightly to the east, and then a new area of low pressure moves in from the west to replace this, and our pattern remains much the same through the weekend. Have a good night, everyone.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.